So nice to have day number 2. Welcome. I'm Marcus Thornburg. I'm the CEO, well, not the CEO. I'm the country general manager for Crossover in Poland. But I'm here to introduce our CEO of Crossover and CEO of Ride Austin, Andy Tryba.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. How's DevOps going so far? Going pretty well? All right. Good deal. So as Marcus mentioned, I run a few companies. One is Crossover. I think you might have talked to some of the folks, but we're basically an online talent marketplace that brings together the best of the best from around the world and assembles them into cloud teams. I run another company called Engine Yard, which is basically intended for Ruby application developers to be able to put their application easily onto AWS and actually use our economies of scale to bring the pricing down. And the one actually that I'm going to be talking about today is actually a nonprofit that I started about a year ago called Ride Austin. And what Ride Austin is basically an Uber-like ride share that we started in Austin. And we actually did it in about 4 weeks or so. I get a lot of questions on how do you actually pull together, how do you even start a two-sided marketplace as a whole. And I'll go through it in a decent amount of detail here. And again, we did it in about 4 weeks, and I'll tell you a little bit about why. But I guess my first piece of advice on if you're thinking about starting a rideshare in 4 weeks is to don't do it in 4 weeks. 4 weeks is a crazy amount of time to start any business, as some of you guys may have started your own startups in the past. I know that we have reviews and what have you that take longer than 4 weeks to do. So it was pretty crazy and hectic to get things up and going in that short amount of time period. But we were actually able to do that, and I'll talk a little bit more about what it actually takes to build something like this. So just real quick on why we even decided to start Ride Austin. And if what happened in Austin was a bit unique, but not actually terribly unique compared to what Uber and Lyft actually do around the world. And Uber and Lyft basically, they got into a fight with the Austin community. Similar to what happened in Italy recently, where they got kicked out, and this happens in many cities around the United States. But Austin was a bit of a unique scenario, where what happened in Austin was that rather than them actually getting into a bit of a disagreement with the city council, what they did is they actually pushed for a vote. And what they were fighting on was really this notion around fingerprint-based background checks. If you think about all Uber drivers, they go and get background checked, and you typically in the US do it just straight on the app, and you're approved in 24 hours or so. And what fingerprinting does is that fingerprinting actually takes it to a slightly higher level as far as the level of security, but it also requires people to actually go into a physical location to go, of course, get your fingerprinted. Takes longer, adds friction to the process. Uber and Lyft basically believe that when you add friction to the driver sign-up process, of course, you get less people to come on board, and then you get less drivers, and then you end up getting long pickup times. Actually, like I did this morning, which I was like 13 minutes to get an Uber here today. So they went and they pushed for it to be a vote. And what ended up happening is that they put about $8 million actually into the vote itself. And they were doing robocalls and doing a bunch of things like that to actually win the vote. And they lost. And what ended up happening at that time actually then is that they actually just picked up all their toys and went home. And for a city like Austin, who has roughly a million people or so, there were about 125,000 rides that were going on a week, and there were about 10,000 drivers that were driving for Uber and Lyft that were instantaneously out of a job. And when you think about those 125,000 rides that were occurring, these aren't just rides that were people going to bars and what have you. It was really also people that had to go to their doctor's offices. Were going to visit their families and others. So we were passionate believers that any modern city, any smart city has to have some type of rideshare program. But also equally important were those 10,000 drivers, in that they were instantaneously out of a job. And it doesn't matter who you are and how much money you're making. If you are instantaneously out of some or all of your income, you're put in a bad situation. And we've spoke to a bunch of drivers, and a lot of them drive for Ride Austin now. And some of these people lost their homes because they could no longer pay for their mortgage. Some of them, like one of our drivers, was going through cancer treatments at the time, and they were using the Uber income to help pay for some of their treatments. So they were put in bad situations. So what we did is we brought the tech community together, both from a Austin tech community perspective as well as a global tech community, to solve this particular problem. And we knew that we had to do it fast because, as I mentioned, there were lots of people that were out of a job. So we literally crammed to do it in 4 weeks. We didn't sleep very much at that particular time, but it was a great experience on actually what it actually takes to develop a two-sided marketplace. And these were some of the core principles that we started on, because we were doing this for a different reason than, hey, I want to go and start a new rideshare company. So the first one was that we did this for Austin, right? We were trying to get the drivers back up and going. We wanted to ensure that we gave back to the local community and to make sure that there's this positive circular model. We actually have a feature called a Roundup, which actually enables riders to actually round up their fare. So if it was $14.50, it rounds up to $15, and that other 50 cents. You can actually choose which charity that you want to donate it to, and we have about 60 charities in the app. We wanted to also ensure that we actually did it as a nonprofit. And the reason we did it as a nonprofit was that we knew that as we got more efficient, we could actually lower the prices, but actually be able to pay the drivers more. If you look at what Uber and Lyft typically do, if you look at the typical ride, they take anywhere between 25 and 28% of that, and then they give the driver the rest. And then what we basically do is we basically give 100% of that ride fare to the driver instead, to be able to enable them to maximize their earnings. And then the last piece that we really thought was important was that we are big passionate believers in this notion of open data. So similar to the open source community, we believe that it's really important for mobility services as a whole, for all of us to actually collaborate and share our data, to be able to take things to the next level, and be able to do things like autonomous vehicles and others. You can't have these little small silos of data. You have to actually work together. So we actually publish our data on a weekly basis. And if you Google my name, there's a ton of different blogs that I've done on being able to shine some light actually into what it takes to build a rideshare, but really any two-sided marketplace as a whole. So how have we done? So in the first year, we literally had our 1-year anniversary 6 days ago, and we're right around 2 million rides or so that we've completed. At our peak, we were doing anywhere between 60 and 70,000 rides. We've actually done significantly more than that during big events like South by Southwest. We've got about 400,000 riders accounts, and we've got about 5,000 drivers or so that drive for us on a regular basis. We've been able to actually donate about $250,000 to local charities. And as I mentioned, that we do pay the drivers more, so we've been able to actually pay them about $5 million more than what they would have made if Uber and Lyft were actually in town. So lots to do. A lot of acceleration. Took a lot of work, but it's been a ton of work. It's just been a ton of fun. And we've been, of course, a bunch of awards, and we work with local charities and what have you, as I mentioned. But the purpose of this particular talk was to really discuss, okay, well, with you guys sitting back, thinking back, hey, how do I start one of these if I wanted to do that? And obviously, my first piece of advice was of course, don't do it in 4 weeks. Give yourself enough time to actually do it, so you can actually get some sleep, and your family will actually appreciate that. But I'll give you just 5 quick tips on some of the things that we learned over the past year that may help you guys if you guys are thinking about starting something like this. So first things first. And this isn't intended to be a plug for Crossover, even though it may actually look like that. But just like any startup, you have to have the best people in the world working with you to go and make that happen. If you look at our overall stack that we had to develop for Ride Austin, we've got, of course, our iOS team. We have our Android team, and there's both a driver app and a rider app. We have a big set of Java folks that are working on a lot of the server code, as well as we're big on AWS. But when you look at the overall architecture, you have to have the best people to not only be able to develop an app that you're going to have 400,000 people use and 70,000 rides a week or so, but you also have to ensure that you go and solve the really, really hard problems. I'll give you one example on the server side, for example, since you guys are primarily Java guys, is that you have to think about in a typical rideshare model. You have your app up, which of course pings your GPS location. Working with some of the Google APIs. Maybe you type in your end destination, gives you the route, the whole 9 yards. But you have to then dispatch that to a set of drivers. And that dispatch algorithm was kind of an interesting one to develop in that, the first thing that you think about is, okay, well, I obviously know where all of the drivers are because I have their GPS locations going on real time. But who do you actually choose to be the one to actually go and say, okay, you're the one that's going to go pick up this person, right? So we first started with just distance. Seems like it makes sense, right? Like if I'm going to just go dispatch it to the closest driver. And the way that the dispatch model works is that it's actually a serial-based model where basically the drivers get 10 seconds to determine whether or not they're going to pick you up or not. And that's why when you look at your app, sometimes it says, you can get picked up in 5 minutes, but then the actual driver that picked you might be 10 minutes away, so it might change. But you have to pick the right driver. So then you're like, okay, at first we started with just raw distance away. We then realize, that's actually not good because you can actually have a river between you and the rider, and as a result of that, you can unfortunately be in a situation where that guy's actually, even though he's only less than a kilometer away, it may actually take him 30 minutes to go pick up the person. Not such a great experience. So then we were like, all right, well, Google actually gives you a time distance API, so let's use actually the time distance away from it. So we started using that. But then you're like, okay, well, unfortunately, the raw distance API is free, but the time distance API they actually charge you money for. So we were in this scenario where we were spending tons and tons of money using Google APIs, and that wasn't going to be a good solution either. And you also want to look at things like the driver ratings and preferences and things like that. So what we ended up doing is coming up with an algorithm that basically says, okay, first I'm going to actually use the free API, which is which is raw distance away, and I'm going to populate a table that then says, okay, here's the top 10 drivers for this particular ride request, which is then free. I'm going to then take the top 3, and I'm going to use the expensive API and look at their time distance it's away. And then I'm going to stack rank those, and that might actually invert people. And then I'm going to go down and do a serial-based dispatch, as well as including some of the other elements. So, in order to kind of get to those types of solutions, you have to have awesome people. And again, whether it be, we were fortunate because, we happen to have the entire ecosystem of Crossover to be able to pull people from with various levels of experience in the rideshare space as a whole. But as you guys consider your two-sided marketplace as a whole, you guys want to think about, hey, how do I get those types of people onto my team? And whether that be, using a service like Crossover or just, the people that you decide to start your companies with, those are the people that you have to be able to solve these tough problems together. All right, tip number 2, And I love this quote from a guy by the name of Guy Kawasaki. I tell all entrepreneurs actually to read his book called Art of the Start. He's a venture capital guy in Silicon Valley. And one of the quotes that I love, which is this one here, on if you don't hate your MVP, then you've launched too late. And these are actually, this is actually a picture of the 30 screens that we started with on the Ride Austin side. And we basically analyzed every single screen to determine whether or not it was needed or not. Because, again, in a 4-week time period, or even if you had 4 months, you have to, of course, limit the scope. Even though, you have this infinite roadmap, and we still have an infinite roadmap of things that we're working on. But you have to bring it down to the lowest common denominator. And for us, that lowest common denominator was we needed to have, of course, a rider app and a driver app, since someone has to be able to request it and someone has to be able to pick them up. A server dispatch algorithm, which was rudimentary at the time. We didn't get to that better solution until later. But we really tried to break it down, and we only actually started with an iOS app. We didn't even have an Android app because we knew that we couldn't do it all at the same time. So we just focused on iOS only. And we actually only had even one car type. So if you think of, you guys using Uber here, you have Uber Pop and Uber Select. On the Ride Austin side, we have 4. We've got our standard, we've got our SUV, we've got our premium, and our luxury. And we knew that every time you actually add another car type, you're adding complexity, right? Because not only do you have to then look at, okay, now I'm a user and I can swipe over to this other screen and I can look at all of the SUVs instead of just all of the regular cars. I now also have to give that user a estimated time. I have to then dispatch and know, which of my drivers are SUV drivers versus standard drivers. I then have to basically, do that same table population on dispatch. And oh, by the way, SUV drivers, if they want on their app, they can actually choose to also drive for standard. So you just add all of this complexity on what I would consider to be a small feature, which is, we're just going to offer another car type. So as you guys think about your businesses and what have you, I think that this is a really important part, is that, I think as developers, we all tend to think about, look at all these great features that I want to do, and it's my product isn't good enough unless I go and have these things, and don't do it, right? I mean, literally, the minimum viable product. And oh, by the way, oftentimes this minimum viable product is nearly free. Nowadays, and I tell all entrepreneurs this, is that because Guy Kawasaki has another great quote, which is basically, you don't know anything until you actually ask someone to take money out of their pocket and put it into yours. And what he means by that is that, a lot of times we get into, all of us as product people, we get into this notion that we want to go build this product, and sometimes you just don't know whether or not that it's actually a real service or not. I'll give you a small example. So my first company was a company called ExtendMD, and this is back in 2006. And what we did there was chronic disease management. So think of someone with like high blood pressure or diabetes or what have you, and they're measuring their condition at home 99.9% of the time, multiple times a day, and they're keeping all this data there. But they're only going to see the doctor once every 3 months or once every 6 months. So what we thought is like, hey, wouldn't it make sense to have that person actually upload their information, and then for a doctor to be able to see all the information and see who's inside and outside of the nominal ranges, and be able to then help that person and maybe tweak their medication or maybe even save lives. So we spent 2 years developing it, basically, getting all excited. We got the teams going and what have you. Actually was Java backend. And then we go to launch it. And then we first went to patients, and we were like, hey, patients, here's a great way to take all your data. This can save your life. And, they started using it. They're like, Andy, love it. And I'm like, great. Are you willing to pay me $10 a month for it? They're like, oh, I don't know. I pay $10 a month in the U.S. For my copay, which is our insurance. And they're like, I pay $10 a month for that, which basically gives me like a liver transplant if I want. I don't want to pay you $10 a month. I like it, but I want to use it for free. We're like, free doesn't work for us. So then we're like, okay, well then we'll go to the doctors, right? And we're like, hey doctors, patients love it. Look at this ability to go and see all of your patients' information, and you can save lives. Think about, aren't you just so much of a better doctor if you can save lives? And don't you want to pay me $10 a month for it? They're like, Andy, love it. But I get paid to look at data. I don't actually pay you for data. No, I don't want to pay you. And furthermore, actually, now that I think about it, if I have the data and, I don't know, someone has a condition and dies and I don't actually do something about it, then I'm actually responsible. And they might actually sue me. So I don't even want the data unless unless you can pay me. You're like, oh, okay, well, I obviously can't do it for free. Obviously can't pay you to do it. They're like, oh, but insurance pays for half of my bill, so why don't you go over and get the insurance guys that pay for it, and they can pay for it. And of course, every single one of these transitions take another 6 months because you're product guys, and you have to tweak the interface and the screens and everything to go and make that happen. And then we go to the insurance guys, and they're like, hey, patients love it, doctors love it, don't you want to use this? And they're like, great, love it, Andy, that both sides love it, and if you give me a triple blind study with 20,000 patients, we're happy to roll it out to our community. I'm like, I don't even know what a triple blind study is. I know what a double blind study is, so Google triple blind study. They're like, oh, it takes 2 years and $2 million. I'm like, oh, don't have that, right? And then they're like, oh, but if you go talk to the government actually pays for half of my bill, so maybe they'll actually pay for it, right? So all of these, and we ended up fortunately finding a unique area in medicine called concierge medicine, where people have actually removed themselves from the insurance network, and they have a direct financial relationship with the doctors. And then we ended up selling it to a company actually in that space. But all that to say, that the whole notion of being able to go out there and do an MVP and do it on the cheap to figure out, whether or not you have a business model, because we could have and it took 6 years basically to kind of do full circle from when we started it to when we actually found our market and sold it. And nowadays with Google Sheets and all this other stuff, like I always tell people, I'm like, go do it for free, go do it in like 2 weeks, and then you're gonna hate it. Just like Guy Kawasaki says, and you're like, this isn't even my product. But you're proving whether or not someone is willing to take money out of their pocket and put it into yours. And if the answer is no, then you have to go and find the right market to be able to go and make that happen. And certainly a huge part of tips that I always give entrepreneurs. All right, so number 3, building a community. This seems like one of those like grandiose things that people say, but for us it was critically important. And the reason it was important is that we knew nothing about how to actually start a rideshare, right? I mean, other than being riders, we had no idea, what needed to occur on the server backend. We had no idea, like I said, on the dispatch or, working with the 9 different Google APIs that we use, or working with, the Stripe API on payments, working with fraud, working with, how do you actually pay the drivers, what frequency, that 10-second algorithm, all of that. We had no idea. So fortunately, if you build a community, in our case, the 5,000 drivers, they will tell you what your roadmap actually needs to include. And sometimes they tell you very forcefully what that roadmap needs to include, in that, hey, you're an idiot, why do you not have this? But nonetheless, it's actually great feedback. And it's one of these that it was absolutely critical, at least in our business, to go and use, because we didn't necessarily, even though we had the best people in the world from iOS and Android and Java and what have you, it wasn't, no one had ever actually built one of these before. So we were really fortunate to have the community kind of give us that feedback. And same deal on the rider side, where even though you are a rider and you've used these before, it's very different when you're actually thinking about the feature sets and what to prioritize, and they will kind of give you that feedback on what's actually needed. So on our side, what we basically did is on the riders, we basically got 100 of our friends, right? And we're like, hey guys, free rides, right? Help us with this app. It may crash, it may be buggy out of the chute, but like, you're gonna get free rides. So they're like, great, awesome, I'm gonna do it. And Uber and Lyft, they weren't there, so they're like, why not? And then on the driver's side, we basically built a Facebook community page for after all the people kind of applied to become a driver, and then it was just like a real-time feedback where I would we put out 50 different versions of the app in the last year because literally it was like once a week we're putting out new releases. Sometimes they were bug fixes, and other times they were features. And just iterating over and over and using the community to not only collect that feedback, but they then become advocates for you, because it's a bit like when you're proving that you're listening. You're listening, and then you're iterating, you're listening, and then people love it when you actually implement the stuff that they suggest. And by doing that then actually helped us actually have a loyal rider base that actually exists today. And also, of course, our drivers are incredibly passionate, and I think that they associate with the same mission that we have, and as a result of that, we've been able to kind of maintain this unique model. So point 4, and this is the tough part of doing any type of two-sided marketplace, is that it is super expensive. There's a reason why Uber lost $2.8 billion last year alone, is that you have to incentivize basically both sides of the marketplace. And this is true for any marketplace, where if you think about the rideshare world, drivers have no incentive to actually use and have your app on if they're not making money. And riders have no incentive to actually use your service if there's no drivers. So you're in this chicken or egg scenario where you have to have a bunch of riders to have a bunch of drivers. You have to have a bunch of drivers to have a bunch of riders. And when you're starting out, you have none of it. And there's no world where you just actually start the business and then magically, some fairy dust or something occurs and you have both sides of the market. What it takes is actually tons of money, basically, incentives on both sides. So on the drivers, what we had to do is we had to basically, pay a bunch of these people a guaranteed hourly rate so that they would stay on our platform because there was no rides. So they're not making any money. So but you're like, no, it's gonna come. Just let's pay for X number of drivers to be on the system. And then on the rider side, they've got no incentive to use your product because you have no drivers. So you pay for the drivers. But then on the rider side, you're basically like, my product is basically worse than perhaps what else is out there, at least in the near term until you kind of get up and going and you iterate and learn. So how about free rides, right? So you give out all of these promos of free rides or discounted rides and things like that, and you really you basically juice both sides of the marketplace. And what you can see here on that little arrow is basically where we did that, right? Where early on, it was too early to do it because we didn't have our Android app. We were, still trying to figure things out. But you kind of get to a point where you're like, okay, I think that I've got this now. And then you're like, okay, now I need scale. And this is actually the point where I typically recommend entrepreneurs to actually go raise money, because you've proven the model, and now you're actually just looking at the scale element of it. In our side, we raised a bunch of donations, and we put close to $7 million or so actually into going and accelerating that market. And you see the impact immediately. We went from 20,000 rides up to 50,000 rides, and then from there you see a bit of seasonality because the rideshare market has regular seasonality. People don't Christmas, for example, people aren't cruising around. And then you have kind of what I would consider to be typical organic growth from that point up to about 70,000 rides. That big peak is a little bit different, and I'll talk more about that here in a sec. But literally, what you see here on the left-hand side is actually how much it was costing us. So we were basically losing, and this is hard to see from back there, but we were losing almost $9 a ride, and our average ride was $11. So literally, our ride was $11, and we were losing $9. So that means we were basically $20 net for the ride. And then, of course, as time goes on, you can change your incentives, and you also get better. And then you kind of build yourself into profitability per ride. And we make $1 or $1.50 per ride now, and we pump that all back into the business, of course. But But as you guys are thinking about your businesses, this is really important for you to think about is this both sides of the marketplace and what it actually takes to go do. And then the last piece of knowledge that I guess I'd have for y'all is that you will meet a ton of people. They're like, oh yeah, totally. This is how you do scale. You use AWS, you use Aurora, and you use Redis, and yada yada yada. You're in good shape, right? And they are basically lying to you because you have no idea what scale looks like until you actually go and do it. And then you realize that every single one of these scale points, you break along the way, right? You're like, oh, I didn't realize that query actually was, gonna, do a database lock. Oops, right? And then you go and you fix it fast and what have you. So it's one of these where you have to just continue to iterate, but you accept it, right? During South by Southwest, which is that huge, tall piece of grass is what it looks like. Oh, this chart, by the way, is weekly volume, in case you missed that. But we did 181,000 rides in that 2-week time period, which is obviously way more than we ever had before. And and a lot of the stats were great because we were able to pick people up in 3 minutes and 28 seconds, and we had 2,300 drivers any given day. But and you could read about this if you look at some of my blogs. But we crashed the first weekend, that first Friday night. Everyone comes into town. Everyone's excited. We're monitoring the servers. Our everything from our database connections, because we actually use long polling, to our CPU, and things are looking good. And we're like, great, we're good architecture, right? And then it starts to rain. And it turns out that when it starts to rain, people stop walking and they start looking for cars. So literally, it spiked traffic. Actually, some of the other rideshare companies in town, they crashed. That actually sent even more volume over to Ride Austin. And then now we've got rain, South by, other people crash. We crash, right? So literally it brings the whole system down because it's one of those that you don't know what you don't know, and it's one of those that we were able to get back up and going, but it took way too long. It took about 3 hours or so for us to figure it out, and because every time we would actually turn it back, do the fix, turn it back on, it would basically everyone would flood it right away, and then it would spike it and crash it again. So we're like, okay, I guess that didn't work, all right? And because it was a different problem then, because we didn't necessarily anticipate a immediate going from 1 to 10,000 RPMs, right? Typically we ramp up. So then we actually had to okay, not only did we have to find the right solution, we then had to basically basically governor the different people that we brought on. We're like, okay, great, we're going to bring 5,000 riders on at a time, right? And then we basically were able to get up and going and recovered. Now we obviously still did tons of rides, but it's one of those good learnings in my mind. And that's not the only time we crashed, right? I mean, we definitely have crashed, in every single scale point, basically, as you go from, our first day was like 160 rides, and, I guess, in that week, again, we were doing 20,000 rides, right? So you go from 160 rides a day to 20,000 rides a day, and, you're going to break multiple times along the way. So it's just all about, you should assume that that's going to happen, and you take your hits on social media or whatever else it may be, and then you iterate and move on. But it's going to happen, so you guys should definitely consider that as a big part of it. But we're also big fans of being open, honest, and transparent, right? Where not only do we share all of our data, and our entire data set, by the way, is on data.world. So if you guys are interested in dissecting our entire SQL database, we've got our entire dump up there where you can look at all the rides and the times and things like that. But it's all about being honest. You're like, yep, you're absolutely right, community, who are mad, by the way, because you're stuck in the rain. And I think it's another interesting learning was how acute the consumer business is, right? Like crossover goes down for a few hours or whatever, whatever, right? I mean, it matters. We're mad, but there's not like the rage that you get when you're a consumer and you can't get a ride to the airport, or you can't get a ride to some restaurant that you're at. You're mad, and the first thing you do basically you call Andy, But then you're also, posting on Twitter and Facebook how bad this service is and whatever else, right? So it's a super acute business, and it's also just something that you have to accept. But I think that the community as a whole, it will forgive you if you are open, honest, and transparent about what occurred, why it occurred. So actually, for the South by Southwest, I actually even wrote a blog about, hey, here's exactly what occurred, God, and then I actually go into a little bit of technical detail, and then here's what we did about it. And I find that by doing that, they will forgive you and they will stay your customers, as opposed to it just going down and you not saying anything about it or whatever else it may be. It's always best to over communicate and be honest about it, versus trying to believe that you can hide it underneath the sheets. All right, so one extra last minute thing here from a tip perspective, and this is my last slide, is that the temptation while you're growing like crazy, and we went through what I would consider to be hyper growth, right? When you go from 160 rides our first day, again, like I mentioned, to 20,000 rides a day, that is a spectacular growth, and I wish all of my businesses actually went through that growth. It never happens. All right. The temptation is always, well, I'm growing like crazy, so I should add people. I should add resources. I should add people, and most companies do this, right? They just they go from, we had 25 people total, by the way, in Right Austin. They're like, oh, we'll go to 50, you go to 100, you start building. Future's awesome. Keep spending money. And I guess my advice is to avoid that temptation, right? Where you should actually be going the other way, where OpEx in your cash burn is obviously super important, and you never really know, what's going to occur. So you obviously want to be investing for the future and what have you. But if you are continually finding ways to automate and to get more efficient, then you may actually need it to survive. So what you see here, again, back on that weekly chart, is that so Uber and Lyft, as I mentioned, they left last May because of the fight. What they did actually after that is that they invested in 37 lobbyists to lobby the state government. So the way that it works in the U.S. is that you got city government, state government, federal government. So they lobbied basically at the state level to overturn the city rules, and they were able to, with those 37 lobbyists, overturn the city rules. And they came back actually 3.5 weeks ago now. And whenever, Uber's worth $68 billion, Lyft's worth $9 billion. I think collectively they've got $12 billion in cash between them. Turns out we don't have $12 billion in cash. Whenever you're going against, pretty spectacular competitors like that, they're obviously going to come back in and they're going to leverage that cash position, but they're really good. So you're gonna lose share. And we of course knew that at some point they were going to be back. So we had always prepped for it, and we actually then avoided that temptation to go and continue to add headcount. And actually, in full honesty, I probably should have added more headcount, but I didn't intentionally, to kind of be able to sustain what we're going through now, which is literally in 1 week, basically our volume dropped by 55%. So we were doing, 60, 70,000 rides, and we're at this point, and we've actually bottomed out a bit. We're doing roughly about 22,000 rides a week now, whereas we were doing about 20,000 rides a day during South by. And it's one of those that if we would have continued to add a bunch of headcount and what have you, our operational capability to actually sustain at 20,000 rides, or now we're actually now we can actually operate even less than 20,000 rides, would have been worse, right? Because we would have had all this other headcount that we would have had to pay for, and that we would have had to basically shut down, immediately as Uber and Lyft came back. And then that would have, of course, not been able to pay the drivers more. That would have not been able to contribute to local charities, not been able to do a lot of the additional experiments that we want to do in the rideshare space as a whole. So I think it was good that we didn't add a bunch of headcount, and we're actually even reducing our OpEx even more. We shut down our office, for example, and work from home, which obviously I'm a big fan of. So all of these types of things we were able to avoid. And as you guys think about your businesses, and if you guys were to do a rideshare or any marketplace, is avoid the temptation, because it is, again, when you're cruising along over here on the left-hand side of this chart, you're like, oh, it's gonna last forever. It's awesome. I've created something awesome here, and maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but you have to look out for the day that happens, which is, which is reality, and we'll see what happens from here. Part of that is the market contraction, because the market slows down in the summertime and picks back up actually in the fall. But without a doubt, they took, I'm sure that they took share, right? We were number one in the market, so we had about 50% market share, and I believe that we're roughly about 20 to 25% market share now. So again, as you guys consider it, one last little tip here. So, all right, well, so with that, appreciate the time. That's my Twitter handle. If you guys have any questions about, as you guys start your own businesses and think about this type of a two-sided marketplace, feel free to reach out. I'm a big fan of enabling people to drive innovation, because I don't believe, whether you're talking about mobility services as a whole in this particular rideshare space, or just simply two-sided marketplaces in the on-demand community, there's going to be tons of additional opportunities that are out there. And it's not like, oh, Uber and Lyft in this case, they rule the world, and there's not opportunity for profitable niches. And I do believe that they exist. And whenever markets grow, there are additional opportunities that come to be. So don't so go out there and kind of do something special, and don't be afraid to do it, because again, I do believe that it takes a bunch of people like y'all to go and create the future, and I definitely recommend doing that. So, all right, guys, well, thank you very much.